Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Security Expo podcast, and I am your host, John Bigelow from Security Solutions Media, and we are talking today about the insider threat with Julian Claxton. Julian, welcome back.
Thank you, John.
Insider threats are interesting. They seem to have evolved in a fairly significant way over the last probably couple of years due to a range of global issues. Take us through where you see that evolution at the moment.
I think the interesting thing is that insider threats have been around since Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
In essence.
Yep.
We just see it manifested in different ways now. And you're right, the digital and cyber landscape has particularly accentuated insider threat interests, threat vectors that we're seeing in the market now that we didn't have to address maybe 15 years ago or even sometimes 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing that proliferation from human-centric insider threats to cyber-focused insider threats, social media, and the proliferation of the manner in which people utilize social media to get their points across. At the same time, they're using social media to exfiltrate information. And There's been a number of cases of insider threat actors that have posted confidential information on various chat forums or publicly available forums, some of which are locked down, some of which aren't. And it's given a voice to people who, whilst perhaps not setting out to be insider threat actors per se, their actions can often have a devastating effect. And so the advent of technology, the advent of artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is often incorrectly assigned, people call AI, things people call AI are often machine learning based technologies, but regardless of the semantics behind it or the reality, the bottom line is that we're seeing a dangerous precedent set now where we're communicating in a digital forum, but communicating with digital forums, if that makes sense.
And that's a really interesting point that I want to touch on. So traditionally, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the expert in this, I am not, but traditionally the profile of an insider threat has revolved around reward, ideology, coercion, and ego. They're the four drivers of how we try and turn someone or get the information that we want. And that, whilst the reward, the coercion, and the ego thing haven't changed, the ideology thing has. And we're getting more and more by way of social media now, people feeling affronted, people feeling aggrieved, because that's the model for social media. It's like we sell grief, we sell outrage, we sell anger. And so what you're seeing is, I believe, you're seeing more and more people getting upset over things that they don't necessarily understand, and they're jumping on forums and having arguments with chatbots. They
Absolutely.
don't even know that they're arguing with an artificial chatbot.
Correct. And they get very passionate, but the problem with that wouldn't be such an issue if it was contained within that chatbot environment.
Yep.
But what happens is that they then take their gripes beyond that, and they use peripheral media interests to then shout a little louder and to make their complaints and to grieve their problems, to share their problems in other forums. And so it might start with a chatbot that you're communicating with. You've got no idea that you're actually dealing with a computer.
Yep.
You then work yourself up. You get yourself into a frenzy. You then get onto, it might be your Instagram account. It might be your Facebook account. Can you believe that this is happening in such and such? And it then becomes this movement, and it just grows and grows and grows. And I think that's the issue that we have yet to address as a community, is understanding how these artificial forums, let's call them, can be so incredibly detrimental to the community, detrimental to individuals. They're affecting, the systems, the social media, the communication forums that we're talking about are affecting people's mental health. And of course, that then becomes an additional and peripheral problem when we're dealing with insider threats. So there's so many different facets that we're all having to address, but we're immature in this space. We don't know the best way to deal with it. And we need controls and we need regulation accordingly.
Yeah. And part of me wonders whether or not there's an education campaign that almost needs to be run there, whether it's by the government or someone else sort of saying, there's a Russian term in intelligence circles that refers to useful idiots. And a lot of people don't realize that that's exactly what they're being used as.
Absolutely, yeah. And the community is ignorant. And it's not the entire community. I think it's a very, very small segment of the community who just don't realize that they're being played for pawns.
Yeah.
or as pawns. I don't think they understand the context of their shouting and screaming and the impact that that could have, not just on them or their immediate family or their associates, but wider communities, particularly when you look at some of the more controversial topics that we're dealing with currently across the globe, whether it be conflict over in the Middle East, whether it be political interests over in America, and there's a lot of discussion in reference to Biden versus Trump, for example, and that in itself builds anger and resentment, and you're either one way or the other, and we're now starting, sadly, to see it in the Australian political landscape as well.
Yeah, but that's part of that thing that we were talking about before when we touched on sort of ideology. We've moved away from this concept, I believe, of being, you might have a differing opinion from me, but there was that whole thing for a long time of, democracy was based on the idea that, the great thing about democracy is you can completely disagree with me, but I will fight to the death for you to have the right to hold that opinion. Whereas now, my go-to seems to be, if you disagree with me, my immediate rebuttal is to make you feel ashamed and embarrassed for thinking something different.
As a modern community, we have bred people, and it's a terrible term, but I think it's real. We have bred people who lack respect and humility.
Yeah. And that, again, drives that whole, when you put this in the context of social media and smart devices, what you're seeing, and it's being widely reported in the media, is online radicalization.
Absolutely. It's a big, big problem. And it happens across all facets of these topics that we're talking about, whether it be conflict, whether it be sexual preferences, and that, of course, has been quite a divisive topic over a number of years, whether it be political interests, are you left or you right, are you centrist, and whatever the circumstance might be. It affects every facet of society, and our younger generation don't know any better. And this is the really frightening part about it, is that kids today, and this is why the government in Australia is now talking about
how old you sounded just then.
It's terrible.
Kids today.
I know.
Seriously.
I know. And I have a sneaking suspicion I might be just a couple of months older than you, John. The reality is that the government is now saying, well, we do have a problem. We're going to need to address this. How do we address it? They're talking about limiting access to social media amongst the kids today, but for valid reason. But of course, those kids today are jumping up and down with rage, and the rage isn't necessarily focused on the fact that they're not going to have access to Facebook or to Instagram or whatever that platform is that they're accustomed to now. I am old because I don't know what they all are. I'm acknowledging it. Here it is officially. It's not necessarily that they're complaining about access to those platforms. The complaint is now for the sake of complaining because it gets attention.
Yeah.
And we are so attention-seeking as a community now based on likes. And I can't think of the name of the show, but there was a particular online medium that had a program that depicted the manner in which you live your life and your success based on the number of likes you get, thumbs up, thumbs down.
Black Mirror?
Black Mirror, thank you. And it was actually really frightening to watch that. I think the writers and producers of that did a brilliant job of highlighting what is actually reality, not what might be reality. We're already there, John.
Yeah.
And kids are reliant upon how many likes they get. My own child is in that position.
Yep.
Looking at how many likes are garnished because of something posted online, and I didn't get enough likes, so I have to change it. Well, why do you have to change it?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the onus now needs to be put back on parents, particularly. You talk about indoctrination through online forums. Parents are responsible for that.
Yeah.
And I don't care what the socioeconomic or intellectual levels of those families and what have you are. It's irrelevant.
Yep.
And I only raise that because it often comes up in discussion.
Yep.
The bottom line is anybody who cares about their children should be focused on those core principles of life that really revolve around respect and humility.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing that's coming out of a lot of this too is that as we see more and more engagement with online forums and whatnot, we get these global issues occurring, like, as you alluded to before, conflict in the Middle East. And for whatever reason, totally uninvolved random organizations feel the need, due to social pressure, to stand up and take a side and make a public statement about they support X or they support Y. And I imagine from an insider threat point of view, that presents all sorts of challenges, because if I work for, John Bigelow's soft drink company, and they come out and they say, we are in support of party A in this conflict, and I don't agree with their position, there's enough outrage online to incite me to possibly do something dumb.
It's ridiculous. And it's extraordinarily frustrating. I mean, let's not mention specific names, but you look at the coal mining sector.
Yep.
And various organisations were being boycotted because they might have provided, for example, finance to a particular mining sector or organisation. And subsequently, the profits of those organisations started to suffer, not because of the very small percentage of the community that was genuinely against it, but because of the media and social media backlash against that organisation. And then they ultimately caved in.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, well, we're not going to provide, let's say, funding to that particular coal interest, for example.
Yeah.
And that was a small number of people jumping up and down, making a lot of noise.
Yeah.
And whilst I respect that people genuinely and passionately have reasons for objecting to various, economic ventures or mining or whatever the circumstance, conflict overseas, and absolutely there are so many people affected by it. But there are better ways to deal with it.
Yep.
And protesting and screaming and cursing someone who doesn't agree with you is incredibly contradictory.
Yep.
Because you're entitled to the same opinion that I'm entitled to. And if those opinions differ, we should respect one another accordingly. And if we can't come to a satisfactory outcome in our discussions on whatever that topic is, there needs to be a better way of dealing with it than targeting an individual. And we're seeing it constantly in our client environments where particularly high-profile individuals are being unfairly and quite frighteningly targeted by some of these minority, I call them, protest groups or protest interests. And the impact is devastating.
Yeah, I have a theory around this, and I could be completely off in the weeds with this, but I believe that, as you say, everyone has the right to their opinion, but it seems to have morphed into everyone has their right to their opinion as long as they agree with me.
Yes.
And if you don't agree with me, your opinion's wrong and you should be put against the wall and shot. And part of that, I feel like, stems from the change to a remote workforce that occurred during COVID, because traditionally we had to make work in an environment where we're around other people 5 days a week, and you had to make room through social convention for other people's thoughts and opinions because you engaged with them all day, every day at the office. Now I'm siloed away in my own little bubble most of the time, being fed reinforcing propaganda via various social media algorithms that just make me further and further entrenched in my point of view. I don't have to give the same elbow room to other people's opinions that I used to. And as a result, I've become less tolerant and less resilient of other people's opinions, more entrenched in my own views, and probably getting angrier and angrier in my own little world as we travel on.
The tangible devastation caused by COVID is well documented and accepted in society. The financial impost on businesses, on individuals, the mental health issues that people have sadly dealt with are all understood.
Yep.
And we widely accept as a community that we've suffered tremendously globally as a result of COVID. The intangible negative elements of COVID are not so widely discussed. For example, the work from home scenario, most people think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Most people love the fact that they can work from their living room, that they can have a button shirt on and nothing underneath, so to speak, shorts down on their legs. Silly terminology, excuse me.
It's called Donald ducking it, isn't it? Where you've got the vest on up top and nothing on down the bottom.
I can think of a rhyme that goes with it, but this is the wrong forum. This is something that most people actually have really valued and enjoyed.
Yep.
But that intangible element that worries me is that as a society, we have lost our ability to communicate with one another.
Yep.
Having dialogue face to face. Body language, it's gone.
Yep.
people talk about, oh, but you can see them on a screen. But you can't see what their feet are doing or their fingers.
Yeah.
You can't see necessarily the colour of their skin. You can't see when their eyes well up with tears because they're upset about something. We don't have that ability any longer, to your point where you learned to interact when you were sitting in front of one another. We've lost that.
Yeah.
And it is a core facet of society in general. If you think about from day one, we've communicated as people, interlocuted, if that's the right phrase, with one another.
Yep.
We have communicated with one another in a manner that forces us to understand how people behave.
Yeah.
And that behavior drives our behavior. It drives our personas. It drives our impression management both ways. It's reciprocal. We don't have that the way we used to. And I think we are suffering as a result. It's no wonder mental health cases have increased, exponentially since we've had work from home environments.
So what does that then look like for the insider threat? Because if I'm the security manager in an organization and I'm dealing with remote work issues and I'm dealing with increased online radicalization, which I think is an interesting term because people generally associate radicalization with terrorism, which it's not. It's just literally getting someone to the far end of the spectrum of reasonable action on any issue. It doesn't have to be terrorism. If I'm dealing with online radicalization and I'm dealing with a remote workforce and all the rest of it, what does the insider threat look like now as opposed to, 5 years ago? And how do I deal with that?
Well, let's look at the financial element of that.
Yep.
It's become extraordinarily expensive to monitor and to combat insider threat cases or scenarios, because whilst we do have a reliance now upon technology, monitoring user behavior analytics and what have you, who's accessing what file structure, who's emailing what, that's been around for a long time and it's effective and it's important. But what we can't do is provide the same level of security, by way of example, at somebody's residence, because, and I think we might have had a chat about this in one of our previous podcasts where we discussed the fact that it's very easy to, well, not easy, but there are systems in place that enable us to protect, say, the boardroom of our corporate headquarters in the middle of George Street, Sydney, or Collins Street, Melbourne, for argument's sake. And you spend a certain amount of money and you have a certain level of security control in place and mitigation strategies, and you can control and regulate that environment that all your staff are coming to every day. We now might have, say, 2,000 staff going to 333 Collins Street pre-COVID.
Yep.
We're now at a position where we have 2,000 staff going to 2,000 addresses. And so we don't have the ability to regulate and to manage and to control the security environments as one point alone, to answer your question.
Yep.
Then you've got peripheral concerns because there are weak points in that security chain, let's call it. Who are your neighbours? How loudly do you talk when you're on a conference call? Do you have a secure VPN in place?
Yep.
And whilst you might think that organisations have got all of those controls managed, I can tell you from first-hand experience, it's rare.
Yeah.
And so companies don't necessarily have the money. They don't always have the ability to access a person's home environment, nor the appetite to do it. I can see why Chris Minns, the Premier here in Australia, in New South Wales, is pushing to have the public sector workforce go back to offices. I get it.
Yeah.
The security risk alone is exponential. And I don't think we're addressing it the way we need to be addressing it. A lot of people talk about productivity increasing. So if you look at it from a productivity perspective, I think it's subject to the environment you work in or the nature of the business you're doing.
Yeah.
I still think almost every business, however, absolutely needs to have that interaction.
Yeah.
You need to be communicating with one another to best and better understand what a person is thinking.
Yeah.
And without that, we risk becoming a product of our own creation with respect to digital communication.
Yeah.
Back to the bots.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a lot of trouble distinguishing between real and fake communication channels.
Yeah. It seems to me that the insider threat in the current modern context can be distributed into two buckets. We've got the deliberate action insider threat, the person who's actively seeking to act against the organisation. And then you've got the inadvertent insider threat, the person who doesn't even know that they're acting
Intentional
against you.
and unintentional is the sort of more formal terminology in that space.
And if we look at remote workforce, if I'm doing my job and I'm doing the best that I can, but I'm doing it from the local cafe because I've decided I'm going to go and get a coffee, and I might not even be on their wireless network. I might be on my own network with my own VPN, but I don't know who's sitting behind me.
Without giving too much away, but there's a particular location that I frequent most weeks.
Yep.
And there is a particular woman who, I won't say the sector, but she clearly works in a reasonably high-profile environment, the organisation, and she sits there and has her video calls in the cafe. And I frequently am sitting quite close by, and I hear every single conversation.
Yeah.
Now, the only reason she's doing that is she's bored at home, and I get it.
Mm.
It's probably the same reason I'm sitting in a cafe.
Yeah.
But by goodness, I'm not going to be on a phone to one of my key clients talking about their security vulnerabilities.
No.
In the context of what she's discussing, it's, as I say, it's quite high profile. Some of the things that she's spoken about have frightened me.
Yeah.
She's very lucky that the group she works for is not on my client base, because I can assure you that they'd be getting a phone call. But this is the problem.
Yep. So, I mean, from a modern security manager's point of view, because I don't want to sort of drag this out too long, I know we've got to keep it within a context, but, you know, are there key things that I need to be doing or looking for if I want to try and mitigate the current insider threat issues?
It's a really great question, but also requires quite a broad context answer. I think probably there are two key elements, and we discussed this in the panel discussion this afternoon. I think we need to communicate better.
Yep.
Three things, excuse me. Communicate better, educate more, and improve culture to be more positive than negative. We need to start focusing on everybody collaborating, everybody understanding that they're there to support one another. We need to have robust systems in place, whether you're working from home or from an office environment, that enable anonymous reporting that will be actioned and investigated accordingly. And we need to teach people, we need to teach one another what anomalous behaviour looks like within those environments that we're working. And that anomalous behaviour can be identified whether you're working from home or working in front of somebody in an office. It could be various, what we call grammatical negation, and focusing on the negatives of various elements that might be out of character for that individual, looking for behaviour that is a shift from their baseline, as we call it. But importantly, when we talk about education, it's teaching people what to look for.
Yep. What
does it mean when John comes in one morning? He's usually very sprightly with a smile on his face, whether it be, you know, through your online interaction or you walk into an office. And this morning he came in and somebody said, "How are you, John? Good to see you." And he goes, "Oh, yeah."
Yep.
That's a shift from your baseline. Something's not right. Now, that in itself, of course, is not, you know, reason for concern. But if it then gets flagged that you were trying to log in over the weekend from home into a secure network that you're not working on at that particular time, there's no projects that you're involved with, and somebody in the IT department says, "You know what, I noticed that John tried to access this. It might just be a one-off accident. He might not have realised what file structure he was going into," or something to that effect.
Yep.
And then suddenly there's two indicators there. And then somebody's chatting to you over lunch and says, you know, "What did you get up to on the weekend?" And you said, "Oh, my bloody car broke down again. My dog had to go to the vet because it looks like it's got, you know, hip dysplasia and it's going to cost me $3,000 to bloody fix. Goddamn animals." And they start cursing. And you're not normally that type of character. Now we're starting to see a cluster of concerns. So I'm probably drilling down a little too granularly here, but the reality is that we've got to start communicating with our peers from top to bottom and bottom to top.
Yep.
We've got to start educating people on what to look for, and not just what it is we're looking for, but why we're looking for it.
Yep.
What does it matter that John's grumpy today?
Yep.
Why is that important? And what does it matter that John's grumpy and he tried to access a file structure he shouldn't have accessed, and then Tina, who sits next to him, was commenting on the fact that he was complaining that his dog's going to cost him $3,000 to get fixed at the vet. Hang on a minute, something's happening here.
Yep.
Now, that doesn't mean that you then need to go and target John specifically, but it might warrant monitoring John's activities online. What does John have access to that he might do something wrong with, potentially. And it may be nothing. You might just be having a bad day.
Yep.
And it comes back to education. From a culture perspective, we have to uplift. We have to start praising good behavior as opposed to punishing bad behavior within organizations. And this is something that companies just don't get.
Yeah.
There are so many disgruntled employees within organizations. I can assure you that your listeners, every single one of them will have a story of disgruntlement. It might be one of their own. It might be somebody they know. It could be their spouse. There is going to be a story that you'd be able to pluck out of your memory banks.
Yep.
And organizations sometimes forget that the employees are the ones that drive them. The employees are resulted upon their success or the other way around. But by the same token, those employees can also be the downfall of an organization. The Edward Snowden scenario.
Yeah.
That disgruntled employee, in his case, it was an ideology shift.
Yep.
He decided that he didn't like what the NSA were doing against the American people. He felt they were doing wrong. He took it upon himself to do something about it. Maybe a different context and a cliched example, of course. But the reality is there are some core and fundamental principles that organizations need to be across: communication, education, and uplifting culture.
It seems to me, though, that the education piece, if you look at the inadvertent and deliberate threat, insider threat, the inadvertent one requires almost as much education, because if we were to use an example of, let's say I am working on a marketing campaign for a very cutting edge, new, innovative project. We're sitting here at the Security Expo in Sydney as we're recording this, and there's no shortage of new products on the stand. So I might be working on a cutting edge new CCTV camera, and I've got the specs for this camera sitting in front of me, and I think, I just need to paraphrase this down so I can write a really good marketing pitch. And I open up ChatGPT and I put all the specs into ChatGPT and say, hey, ChatGPT, give me a 250-word marketing pitch for this particular product. Well, now I've just put very, very proprietary information into the public domain.
I love the fact that you've raised this. And listeners, this was not discussed prior.
Yep.
Literally last week, out of curiosity, because a client raised a similar concern and said that I'm very concerned that several of our employees now are reliant upon ChatGPT to formulate reports back up to the board.
Yep.
So I asked OpenAI's ChatGPT whether or not it was possible, please, to purge all the data that it's received through my communication, and it said no.
Yep.
And it said, but what we recommend is that you don't put any identifying or sensitive material through our system. Well, that ain't going to help. And it's way too late. That horse has bolted in every instance. And I can assure you, anyone who has a keyboard and access to the internet, in almost every instance, who has report deadlines or has to structure some sort of documentation or isn't sure about something within their organization and puts through the CCTV innovative specs of something that's yet to be released, they're going to be doing it, I can assure you. That information that's being gathered, that database, is horrendous. And I myself, I am a user of ChatGPT. I'm one of the guys that calls the target or the person of interest Mickey Mouse. I change everything, cut and paste in an editing software program before I go onto an online forum in that context. I'm one of those, and I'm very, very careful about what I put online. But a lot of people aren't. And people I'm talking to in my social circles, well, no, it doesn't matter. It's not going to go anywhere. They don't get it. They don't understand it. I wouldn't suggest that that's an intentional threat, actor.
But
it's certainly a non-intentional,
an inadvertent one. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's a big issue. And this comes back to education. But artificial intelligence and those chatbots that we're referring to, not bots, excuse me, the ChatGPT scenarios have so rapidly evolved that we haven't kept up with it. Yeah. And I was about to say, I am a user of that product or similar, and I have noticed a remarkable improvement in the quality of information that's provided back to me on a question.
Yeah.
And that frightens me because I'm in a very niche field, a very specialized field. Now, I do it to test it. Yep. I do it because I'm curious. I had a demo provided literally this week in, I won't say where, sorry, of some software that uses chat bots. And my interest was in trying to determine whether I was communicating with a human or communicating with a computer.
Yep.
And so I inputted a series, there was somebody with me giving the demo. I said, can you input this question? Can you input that question? And I put a whole series of emotively focused questions to see if the computer came back with an emotive response. And it was frighteningly good.
Yep.
And I have to be honest, I wouldn't have been able to tell.
Yeah.
And I studied deception.
Yep.
It's getting too good.
Yeah.
And we, as I say, the horse has already bolted, John.
Yeah.
It's really quite frightening. We have to be educating people on that threat, in addition to all the peripheral concerns that we've been dealing with for decades.
So to summarize, if we want to combat the insider threat that seems to be sort of growing with a lot of the vectors that we were talking about before, whether it be social media, whether it be online, whether it be remote work, communication, more effective communication with your staff, education, both about deliberate and accidental ways. The accidental piece there seems to be the key one for me is, obviously you've got to educate people about what does someone who's changing their behavior within the organization and potentially, saying very aggro things online that might look a bit weird and all the rest of it. Yeah, we need to be aware of that. But that inadvertent thing, don't use ChatGPT, don't sit in cafes and discuss private information from the company. Don't talk to strangers on the plane about the thing that you're working on.
To interject in your summary with apologies,
That's right.
You just flagged a point that I think is really relevant to this discussion about working from home. If we bring people back to the office, we can better regulate their ability to access OpenAI's ChatGPT or other similar platforms. We can't regulate it at home, particularly if they've got their laptop sitting next to their work computer on a screen.
Yeah, well, it's now a standard feature on most new iPhones.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And so we had the communication, we had the education, and the last piece, culture. Right.
It's uplifting culture. It's rewarding good behavior as opposed to punishing bad behavior. And management, executive leadership teams and boards need to listen to the workforce. They need to understand when there's disgruntlement and what the cause of that is. Many engagements that we've worked on from a consulting perspective, we have interviewed some formally and with notice and some informally without notice as to who we are and what our intent is. Many of them have come back and said, you know what, they promoted Fred Smith into this bloody role and he was the wrong person, and Janice over here was much better and more suitable for the role, and he is just a total you-know-what, and we're really unhappy about it, and it's because Fred was mates with the boss and so on and so forth, and it creates resentment, and that resentment manifests like cancer.
Yeah,
it's awful watching it go through a workforce, and we see it time and time again. And the irony in all of this is that the right management can fix the problem, but the wrong management is the problem in many instances. And that's just one example of many, of course, but I think it's one that most people would be able to resonate with.
Absolutely. Julian, if people want to know more about you and what you do, where do they go?
They can find more information on our website, jadeconsulting.com, JAYDE consulting.com. And I'm always happy. My contact details are on there. I'm always happy to receive a call. You'll find my profile on LinkedIn under Julian Claxton. Happy to help, happy to contribute to anyone that has any queries.
Julian, thank you very much for your time.